Okay, so a short reflection on the Dhamma. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Dutiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. There we go. So nice to be out here in the forest. Got in a good hike, a nice long one, maybe a couple hours or something like that, and then came to meditate in the forest. And really enjoy kind of doing this kind of thing because, for one thing, this is kind of an imitation, of the lifestyle of the Buddha, the lifestyle of the early monks, who would spend most of their day either wandering through the forest or being in the forest and practicing meditation. And so, there's always a kind of difference, reading about something in the books, right? Like, okay, he wandered by stages till he reached Vesali and then stayed in Vesali, or at one time the Lord was staying in the bamboo grove. That's one thing. And it's another thing to actually go out and walk, try to walk in imitation of the way the Buddha walked, try to meditate in imitation of the places that the Buddha meditated. The story can only contain so many things. That's why it kind of says, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Kind of, the story says he walked through the woods, but walking through the woods, we're here with the different, tones of light. We're here in the atmosphere of the forest. We're here in the smells of the forest. Walking up and down the hills. It says he wandered by stages, but we see what it's like, kind of trekking on for a couple hours. You get the sense in the Buddha's day they did it for 8 or 9 hours, so a kind of a different thing, And this is what Buddhism is actually about, in a sense, because the words of Buddhism are in the books. The instructions are in the books; they're right there. But then when we set out to do them ourselves, we gain a kind of knowledge that's independent. And so the Buddha says, go to meditate in places that are secluded, go to meditate in the woods, go to meditate in places far from human habitation. And you can read about that and imagine what it's like, but then actually being out here and doing it is a kind of different thing. Actually, for myself, just I don't know how it was, how you guys liked it, but just walking around, I find it kind of very, very peaceful. You're just walking. There's no nothing to distract really so much. Billboards. Might be some kids walking in the back, yelling or whatever as they go down the hill, but nothing too big. There's kind of atmosphere here. And when somebody becomes skilled in practicing in the way that the Buddha taught, they keep doing these things over and over again, they gain a body of knowledge that exists outside the books. Because they say a picture is worth a kind of 1,000 words, and then an experience is worth maybe 1,000,000, So it's not just a picture, right? Like you develop the knowledge of what it takes to kind of wander. You develop the knowledge of what places to go, where to look. You develop the knowledge that comes from bringing your mind back to an object of meditation, bringing your mind back to wholesome qualities. And this is a kind of knowledge that goes so much deeper than just a few words. And it's the knowledge that the Buddha was pointing at. That's why he says this kind of this thing is to be experienced individually by the wise. It's to be experienced by the people who practice for themselves. What the Buddha was talking about. And so many of his teachings are like this. He gives kind of a very brief instruction saying, do this, do that, do this, do that. And you see the genius of his instructions because they're not things where he will explain every nuance of where this is supposed to lead, but they're more like something that leads towards many wholesome qualities. So in other words, for example, if somebody takes up a habit of jogging, and they determine for themselves, I'm going to jog, every single day, no matter what, for a half hour. And they set out to jog every day for a half hour. Having that habit in and of itself, if they don't fall away from it, they'll learn a whole lot about a lot of the other unwholesome habits that are attached to not jogging. to sitting at home. So just jogging every single day, they start to notice the effects of, say, eating junk food a lot more, you know? They start to notice the effects when they don't jog for a couple weeks. And they see how that is on their body, you know? They start to, notice the effects of smoking if they smoke a lot more. These kind of things can't really coexist. So in the end, keep following these kind of principles, one or the other has to fall away. Either the jogging has to fall away, or the junk food and the smoking have to fall away. Eventually they can't both coexist together if we keep progressing. And the Buddhist path is the same way. Many of these kind of qualities that he instructs us to follow, they're in short, simple phrases. When we go to practice and we see that they actually pull on a lot of the other negative qualities that we might have been attached to, you know. The person who frequently spends their time, you know, coming to places of solitude to meditate, frequently spends their time bringing their mind back to an object of meditation, what they find is that that starts to pull on other qualities they might not have noticed. So learning to sit down and watch our breath, okay, if we have a habit of being really angry throughout the day, we have a habit of really being really greedy throughout the day, that affects our meditation when we go to sit down. That affects the way our mind is when we come to a place of solitude. That's going on in our mind. And this is in the same way. A person who goes jogging notices when they've been eating junk food. Might not have noticed it before. Right? It's only when this wholesome quality starts, we start to develop in this wholesome quality, that it becomes more obvious, this kind of craving for junk food. It's the same way with our unwholesome habits, unwholesome thoughts. Just doing these things that Buddha said, going out to places of solitude, learning to practice meditation, these things come up right away. Actually, if we, coming out here for a couple hours is really nice. And if we actually ever have the chance to go to a forest monastery or stay in solitude in the woods, doing this for a few days, 3-4 days with no talking and just in solitude, then we really see the echoes of these things in our mind. The kind of sounds of the forest press in on those things. There's no music out there to distract us from these thoughts. There's no billboards. There's no movies. It's just the forest, which isn't anything particularly sense-grabbing, right? And a couple trees and logs and some leaves. So if we want to be able to maintain this practice of going out to solitude, going out to the forest, practicing and moving forward in this direction, one thing or the other has to go. Either these unwholesome qualities have to go, or our meditation has to go. In other words, it's a kind of split path. At first you can kind of do both these things together, but depending on how we want to develop, either one or the other has to fall away. In other words, it's a kind of choice. It's kind of one of these probability trees we did in school where, you go up, this way is 60%, and then you have two more choices that are 30 and 50, and you keep going. There's all these branching directions. Eventually, this kind of thing hits a split where it can branch. And when it branches out in that direction, then we actually have more choices to choose from then. Once we've kind of followed this path up, there's kind of more choices to choose from. Just like a forest path, we take a right or a left. We take a left and we keep going, then there's more paths to branch off from that. So in the same way with our meditation practice, we start this way, learning to come out to places of solitude frequently, on a frequent basis, till it becomes an inclination of our mind, till our mind kind of carries the ambiance of the forest with it, carries the quiet of the forest with it. We learn to meditate frequently on an object, learning to take our mind back to wholesome quality, so that this becomes more and more of a basis of our mind. And when we do this, these other gross, unwholesome qualities, the gross qualities of getting angry and flipping out, of, not being able to control this eating habit, for whatever it is, McDonald's addiction or, drinking beer and these kind of things, they have to fall away. And when they fall away, it's like taking that left-hand path and we suddenly find there's more choices. It doesn't just stop there. Now we have a choice to develop this topic further and further. And this is how the Buddha's path branches on. It's why it's said to be open-aiko, or leading onwards. It leads onwards from each choice we take. Each thing we gives up opens new ranges of possibilities. And we have further branches to go down onwards and onwards to develop more and more skills. And the purpose of developing these skills, the purpose of going further in these directions, is to gain one of them is to gain a greater and greater sense of peace of mind, a greater and greater sense of ease, because this is one of the things we notice, just like a person who's been jogging a lot, before smoking seemed like, oh, no big deal, smoking cigarettes, whatever. Now marijuana is legalized, smoking, no big deal. And, didn't notice it. But then suddenly start jogging every day, you start coughing in the morning. And if you've been jogging for a long time and suddenly you even are around cigarette smoke, you feel the effect on your lung right away. It's like, oh, that's no good. And in the same way, the sensual pleasures in the world that people can sometimes become addicted to, they seem so tantalizing. It's like something you just can't give up. It's so great, can't imagine life without it. But then when we take our minds away from these things to a more wholesome object, and we've been doing that for a while, developing it as an inclination, developing it as a habit, when these things come up again, it's like the cigarette smoke, It seems like something like, oh, this is, this is no good, So in other words, rather than taking these left-hand branches in the forest to these greater and greater paths, to these, moving further along the Buddhist path, giving things up on the way, it's not like we're shunting everything that makes us happy. In fact, we gain a type of happiness that is based on not indulging in these things, a type of happiness that we didn't see before. And this is why the Buddha says the mind is radiant. It's kind of defiled by defilements that come in. In other words, these kind of happinesses, they're available, but they're kind of like an undercurrent, like the happiness that's available from not smoking. It's there, the feeling of health is there, but only when we quit smoking for a while does it become apparent. And so the path of practice is like this. As it opens up more and more branches, we gain a greater and greater sense of peace. But ultimately, coming out to even places of nature has this aspect of teaching us even further, because all the time the aspects of the Buddhist path are in evidence in nature. That's why it tells people to go to places like this. Right now, there's all these kind of leaves, on the ground. There's kind of the trees are changing color. They're kind of coming to old age, and soon the leaves will fall. What does that teach us about impermanence? These reminders are all around us, It's different than the reminders that we'd see in a city. Kind of visions of youth, visions of beauty, visions of health, visions of sensual pleasure. The laws that underpin all these things are really present in the forest. And they're really apparent. So when we come to a forest, we keep going down these various paths, trying to find a sense of peace in the Buddhist paths. We start to notice that all these paths have kind of elements to them that are conditioned. All of them have this aspect of rising and falling, rising and falling. And even the most skillful aspects of the Buddhist paths require maintenance. They're not something that are our true self, that just exists on our own. So eventually seeing these things in this way gives rise to a feeling of what they call samvega, or dispassion. In other words, whatever we grab onto, whatever we hope to consume, whatever we hope to gain pleasure from, all that eventually falls away. All that is eventually subject to change. And for that reason, it's not worth clinging to. It's not worth grabbing onto. It's not a good place to stay. It's just like this forest here, wandering through the forest. Right now it's about 5 o'clock. It's a nice breeze. But somebody told me that tonight it's going down to -7. So if we stay in the forest for too long, eventually the conditions change and it falls to -7. It's not a good place to stay anymore. All of samsara has this kind of principle behind it. Whatever good thing is good to grab onto, it has momentum. Momentums of various types, that can last for a longer or shorter time, but all of them are subject to falling away. So when a person cultivates these perceptions frequently with the desire to find something that's a permanent state of happiness, to find a way to the end of a whole mass of suffering, what they start to develop is a sense of dispassion. All these other factors of the path are important, the factors of kind of, developing these greater states of calm, developing states of ease, developing wholesome qualities. It's important to take these left-hand paths to go on greater and greater branches on the Buddhist path, But ultimately, the forest is not a safe place to stay. Can't stay here too long. At night, it gets cold, coyotes come out, they're hungry. And in the same way, all these wholesome qualities, if we just stay there, if we just take that as our true self and don't try to develop them, try to go beyond them, they become unsafe. They become things that can develop into conceit. They become things that can develop into complacency. All these things have these dual qualities like this. So they notice this in Taoism. That's why they call it the Tao, you know, this thing that has these kind of dual qualities, is bound by opposites. Samsara is like this, you know. Whatever wholesome quality has the potential to shift in on itself in a way and become unwholesome. Whatever unwholesome quality also has, you know, it's a rough way of saying it, also has the potential to lead to things that are wholesome. And this way it gets bound in like a circle. You know, a rich person gets very complacent about gathering wealth, especially down generations. They don't see the dangers of not gathering it. They become poor. People from poor countries, they look around them, they think, I know what this is like. They become very diligent in trying to gather wealth. And these kind of things just keep spinning, like the seasons in the forest, like fall, summer, winter, spring, fall, summer, winter, spring, fall, summer, winter, spring. So ultimately the goal of the Buddhist path is to get out of the forest, to find a way out of the wilderness, to cross the wilderness. Actually, the Buddha uses a metaphor of crossing the stream, you know, crossing the ocean, to find an island. But I guess in this case we get out and find a nice place of safety in the city. Kind of a rough metaphor. But it requires us to go down these paths, you know. It requires us to become familiar with the terrain, you know, of a forest. Become familiar with the terrain of, similar to becoming familiar with the terrain of our mind. We become familiar with the way causes and effects operate in our mind. We become familiar with the way to manipulate them to gain states of peace. But ultimately, like the forest, we recognize that our mind is not a safe place. It's not a safe place to be. It's safer than cars, money, you know, whatever it is, but there's no safe place in samsara. So what we eventually start looking for is a way to go beyond all of that. This is why the Buddha says his Dhamma is like a raft. You know? It's to be made, but it's for the purpose of crossing over. At the end, even the last thing we let go of is the Dhamma. So knowing this, we know that the aim of our practice begins with these things. So it begins with these wholesome qualities that lead onward. It begins with coming to the forest, grabbing on to the simple things the Buddha described, learning to live them for ourselves. You know? We live these things for ourselves, it competes with the unwholesome qualities that we have. They start to fall away. When these things start to fall away, we can go down greater and greater branches of the Buddha's path. But ultimately, it's all for this sake. You know, it's for the sake of getting out. You know, it's knowing that the forest will change. It will become cold at night. You know, the coyotes will be here. And so it's for the sake of trying to find a permanent place of safety. You know, to use the Buddha's metaphor that he so skillfully gives, it's for the sake of crossing the river, for the sake of finding this island that isn't conditioned by anything at all. You know? And that's a place of permanent happiness. So although this is the Buddhist goal, it all starts with things like this. And it's sustained by things like this, learning to live in imitation of the Arahants, learning to come out to the forest, learning to hike, you know, learning to meditate in the forest, you know. And this is how we begin to see what the Buddha really talked about. And this is how we learn to become true to the Dhamma. Because when we become true to the Dhamma becomes true to us. And as Ajahn Lee says, when you become true to the Dhamma becomes true to you. You learn to see what the Dhamma truly is. So those are some thoughts for today for our outing in the woods. And nice to get out here with you guys. And I think I'll leave that for reflection today.